Good morning. Thank you all again for being here and listening to me, and thank you, Dr. Chakravarti. You are the Jon Snow of Calcutta. I hope you'll break a pump handle at some point to change the quality of water there. I'm going to be talking to you about protein specifically today. I think we have talked a lot about the quality of food in this food system. I'm going to focus on protein. And there are several questions one asks. Food sources in the food system, that it's a very high protein source and so on. Yes, they are high protein sources. The question is, do they have adequate amounts of the essential amino acids to meet human requirements? And many times, plant proteins are lacking. So quality protein is an important thing, and so that's the next question. What is quality protein? How do we define it? And there are many ways to define quality protein. Of course, you'd like to define it in terms of function, like how does it promote growth, but those assays are difficult. So protein is now defined in terms of its composition and its digestibility, and I'll come to that. And finally, of course, a very short section on the environmental consequences and costs of providing quality protein if we believe in it. So what is a quality protein? Let's start with that. It is a protein that meets your indispensable or essential amino acid requirements. And you calculate that as an amino acid score. And that score has milligrams of amino acid per gram of protein. That's fine, because you can easily do this, and you have the food tables which will tell you the amino acid score of any protein, and there are excellent food tables available, and you've been hearing about them all yesterday and today. The one thing that's not there is how well are those nutrients, in this case protein, absorbed. And that means, especially for protein, it has to be broken down, so it's digested and then absorbed. One of the problems is that, you often think about how do I feed a human being? And it's a little philosophy, if I can just do that for a bit here. And you often think, well, let me just give them really purified diets. I mean, give them something like a diet where it's 100% absorption of every nutrient, so it's perfect. And yet humans are not evolved for that. You give them a perfect diet, they'll probably die of colon cancer. So you have to think there's something here in the way we've evolved, that we've evolved to eat foods that we don't digest very well, because we unfortunately have to store what we don't digest as excreta in the colon, and that colonic health is very dependent on many other different things. So it's almost like, this quality of protein, you want to digest it fully. So can I, for example, do away with protein and just go and buy amino acid powders, put them together and feed someone? And we have done this. You do this in a clinical situation sometimes when you have patients who can't digest food. And that's a terrible thing to do. And you're just waiting for the day when you can put that patient back onto foods that maybe they won't digest that well, but colonically they feel much better. So it's a complex question as to what is it that is exactly the best quality thing. Right now, we consider a protein that is a good quality protein if it is digested well enough to allow the amino acids that it contained to be absorbed. And those should meet the requirement. So there's a combination of how much amino acid it contains, essential amino acids, and how well they're digested. You multiply the two of them, and you get a score at the bottom there, which is called the PDCAS, which is a protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. Very long name, but that's what it is. But it's not good enough, because unfortunately what you digest ends at the small intestine. The large intestine does not contain transporters for protein, for amino acids. So maybe you'll have amino acids in your colon, but you won't absorb them. So you really have to measure the digestion at the level of the ileum, or the end of the small intestine. And so the FAO came out with another index for amino acids, which is called the DIAF, the digestible ileal amino acid score. Little complex. All I'm trying to tell you is that earlier we used to take digestibility as the difference between what you ate and what came out. It's called an orophycal balance. not good enough. You need what's called an oro-ileal balance. That is what comes out of the small intestine. And that's really difficult, as I'm going to talk to you about. So let's first start with how much amino acids do you need? And I'm really happy Gina Kennedy is here, because there was this time, where is Gina? There she is, yeah. And there was this time when we were all much younger then, it was 2000, I think, that the FAO and the WHO decided to have this committee that would evaluate protein requirements. And I was a rapporteur then, and every evening, Gina, we'd meet in Prakash Shetty's office and complain about how confusing and confused people were. And that WHO FAO committee took 7 years to decide what the amino acid requirements were. Nonetheless, one of the things that happened at that committee was that up to then, in 1985, there was a blue book by the FAO-WHO which defined amino acid and protein requirements. And they were based on nitrogen balances. Nitrogen balances are terribly difficult to do, really difficult, because you lose nitrogen from your skin. You can lose it from sweat, other secretions, hair. So it's really hard to construct an orofecal or orourinary nitrogen balance. And the other thing was that those experiments which were done by Rose actually had a very high energy requirement. So it was thought that those requirements were underestimated. And you know, when you give too much carbohydrate to someone, it escapes digestion, it goes to the colon, and there it stimulates the microbiome, which then begins to use the urea that's in your body itself to recreate protein. And you begin to think, gosh, I've fed protein, and you've got a little factory in your colon that's producing protein, but you can't absorb it. So it's all very confusing. So at the time, we recommendation that protein requirements were really low and amino acid requirements were really low led to a lot of the determination of agricultural policy, which was you didn't need to worry about protein in what you grew because the requirements were low. In other words, you could eat a diet of plain rice for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, nothing else, and you would meet your essential amino acid requirements. You didn't need more. So it's no surprise that policy went in that direction. But there was doubt, and we just couldn't get beyond this nitrogen balance at the time. But then there was a new carbon balance method that was developed both at St. John's and at MIT in the USA. And that was a method in which we were able to use stable isotopes of carbon to track and measure amino acid oxidation. All this means is that earlier you would look at a balance between oral and fecal nitrogen. Now we are looking at a balance between oral carbon and the loss of carbon after oxidation, and we track that carbon with a stable isotope. This is called the indicator carbon balance method, and we use to actually measure the requirements of almost every amino acid, including amino acids under conditions of undernutrition. There was a great deal of speculation at the time that when you were undernourished, you adapted in some way to reduce your requirements. There was equally speculation that if you were chronically infected, you'll increase your amino acid requirements. So there was this both ways kind of balancing act going on, and we needed to measure it and get the proof out. We did that, and there was a series of about 15 papers later, but eventually in 2007, this was used as a primary evidence for the WHO FAO requirements, and it really was, although 7 years for that committee to decide what it wanted. 4 people died in that committee. Tells you how long that committee went on for. But I think it's just beginning to impact policy. And the key important issues that came out of that recommendation, I just have highlighted there. Every essential amino acid requirement went up. So it was a paradigm shift based on a new method of measurement, which was accurate. But the key one was lysine, because lysine is the one that is limited in cereal-based diets. So earlier, if you look at the 1985, on that side, it said your requirement was 12 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day. You could eat rice, nothing else, no problem. But if you need 30 on this side, then you certainly to think that rice isn't going to do it. Well, you could eat a bucket of rice. You could eat 2 buckets of rice, and you'd get enough lysine perhaps. but then you get too much energy at the same time and you become a big fat ball, and then you've met your lysine requirements, but you're likely to die of a heart attack because you have too much of carbohydrate in your system. So this is the problem with balancing diets. And more than that, and this is what was really important for agricultural policy, that in the 1985 requirements on the left here, you'll see that every protein, whether it came from wheat, rice, sorghum, millet, anything, was a great protein. It had a score. Remember I told you the score, greater than 100. And subsequent to 2007, only 2 proteins have that score, and that is legumes or pulses and animal protein. And I want to tell the millet gang over here, I know you love your millets, you love the protein, you love to say it's high quality protein. It's not. It is good, it's got a lot of protein, but it lacks lysine. And you really need to reevaluate that. I think millets are great, but unfortunately it's not high quality protein. I'm happy to argue with you later about this. Now, that's about the requirements. But the FAO then went on, and in 2011, I think, had a meeting in New Zealand where they came out with the next problem, which was, yes, a protein may have all these amino acids, but is it digested? Is it absorbed? And this was an FAO consultation that was held in New Zealand, and this was where we began to think, well, we have to think of a way out. And this is the consultation that said, let's dump the PDCAS, let's go for this new mechanism which is called the DAS. How do you do it? Because the only way you can do it is poke a hole in the abdomen of a person and get that hole to get right into that person's ileum and then collect the stuff coming out. That's called an ileostomy. And if you can do that, then you can create the oro-ileal balance, which then tells you how much is being digested. You can't take the oro-fecal balance. The colon is not involved. The colon is good, does good stuff to you, does bad stuff to you, but it's not involved with the digestion of protein. So we had to get ileal balances, and although we had created that index, we had no clue how we were going to get this in human beings. In New Zealand, there was a massive lab effort to use pigs for this, and there's a pig model, a piglet model, all sorts of things there, but there was no human model. And so we had a meeting in Bangalore, in my place, and we had a really nice FAO meeting there. You can see the group over there. Can you see them all smiling? FAO people are very serious, and it's very hard to get them smiling, except for Ruth. Sorry, Ruth, you do smile. But it is a nice meeting, and everyone's smiling there, including, I don't know if you can see the second on the left in the first row, is a person called Joe Millward, who's a protein expert, most difficult and critical scientist around, and he attained nirvana in this meeting. He's absolutely peaceful and quiet there, you can see him. And so it was a very good meeting, and we actually defined in this meeting research approaches to measuring protein digestibility. And it was really nice because we then took this approach, because we said we've got to do this in humans. So we started doing that. And I just want to tell you, you might ask, why bother? Why do you want to do it in humans? It's done in pigs, and man is a pig. What's the problem? So, well, there was a study that came out from Africa in which someone actually did a heroic, and I think possibly today it will be considered an unethical experiment, where they took little children, about 1 year old, you can see that there, 1 year old children, mainly in Dakar and France, to compare French and West African children. Forget about Abidjan for the time being, the children were a bit older. Just stick with the first 2 columns. And they injected these kids with hormones that would stimulate pancreatic function. So they injected them with pancreazymin and secretin, which are 2 hormones. You won't get permission to do that today. But they did one step further. They then stuck a tube down the kids' gullets into their stomachs and past their stomachs into, they pass the pylorus into the duodenum, where pancreatic secretions come, and then sucked out everything. So they injected the kids and sucked out whatever was secreted by the pancreas. Good luck trying to do that today. You will never. But this was done in these countries and in France. And look at the difference in amylase production, lipase, trypsin, chymotrypsin. I mean, you're talking of tenfold differences in secretion of these enzymes. And it was said at the time that this could be what they call a silent pancreatic insufficiency that occurs in developing countries or third world countries at the time. And we don't know if it occurs in India. We're not sure because we can't do the experiment, but we're thinking of ways and means. I have a student here who's just devoted to actually working out non-invasive ways to measuring pancreatic function. But we think that there is a lower pancreatic function in India as well. So this is about digestibility. As I've told you before, we need an oral ileal balance. Very, very important. And this is just in pictures to show you what it is. You have on this side fecal digestibility, which is oral to fecal. On the other side, the colon is removed. So you've got to collect what comes out of the small intestine. And that means you have to put a hole there. And usually, if you're lucky, you can go to a hospital and find a patient who needed to have that happen. And these are called ileostomy patients. And well, sometimes these are done as temporary measures. Sometimes they're permanent, but typically if you can get someone who's willing to cooperate with you and give you the contents, they wear a bag there, so you can take that bag and collect everything that comes out. But remember that it is still a morbid condition because bacteria begin to grow back into the ileum and change what's happening. But that's the closest you can get to doing human studies. You can do this in a pig and keep that pig on antibiotics and do all sorts of things. We have one of Paul Mount's students here, and I'm sure she knows exactly what to do. But we came up with a different plan, and that was to use isotopes. And what we said was we're going to give two isotopically labeled proteins. We'd have one which was a test protein, and the other which was a reference protein, one labeled deuterium, the other labeled with 13 carbon. And if you gave both these proteins to the person to eat, they would digest both in different ways. But if you knew the ratio of 13C to deuterium in what you ate, and then you measured what came out in the plasma, because they both would go through the liver would mess up those proteins, those amino acids. But here, you would get the amino acids in the bloodstream, that you could look at the ratio there. Now, if you started out with a ratio of amino acid as 1:1 of any one species of amino, say lysine, deuterium and carbon-13 was 1:1. And then in the blood, you found it was half of that. You will then infer that only half of the lysine from one protein was digested and absorbed. Does that make sense to you? It's a very simple system. It's a nice, elegant way, but the problem was we needed to get two types of protein, a 13 carbon reference protein of whose digestibility we knew, and then the test proteins. And so we started, and we started with the University of Agricultural Sciences in Bangalore, because that was not next door to us. We are separated by about 20 kilometers, but that could as well be the whole world because Bangalore traffic is so bad. But we still started there, and this you can see there is the site with what they call a rain out shelter, which allows us to keep rain out. And that's a crop growing of chickpea, I think. And in those pots, we would water them with heavy water. So then the crop would take on that heavy water, and then we'd harvest the seeds, which would have the label incorporated in them. That was a nice thing. And then you could, on the other side, see how we could use those seeds to actually feed very young children and measure the digestibility of those seeds in those children. And there's my student right here, Dr. Nirupama, who's going to present this experiment, these things, where she's looked at complementary foods and their digestibility. I don't want to steal her thunder, but she's got some good findings. But in adults, oh, look, and yes, we wanted to do chickens. We wanted to do milk. We wanted to do high quality proteins, as they call chicken milk. So we actually went into a poultry farm and got these two layer hens, and we kept them in an animal house. And the picture here shows you the hens. They got very used to being fed by a syringe of labeled amino acids. So we just had to feed them labeled amino acids. These are all stable isotopes, by the way. Fed them, and then we collected the eggs. And so we had this whole factory of labeled eggs coming out. It was really wonderful. The most difficult part of this experiment was to get our ethics committee, our animal ethics committee, to think, is chicken an animal? Because they only used to rodents and dogs and so on. But chickens, they never heard of it. So we had to convince them that chickens could be kept in an animal house and then ethically looked after. So this was done, and we've done eggs. And if you look at the whole thing now, we've actually started building a database for FAO eventually, which was reported in the newspapers as a novel method to measure protein digestion. But you'll see here, and this is a series of papers now that will appear in American Journal of Clinical Nutrition and J Nutrition, where we've already looked at chickpea. Look at the digestibility of lysine, it's 44%. Mung bean, 57%. You go, 57%. If you look at dehulled mung bean, it improves for, it improves for all the amino acids. So you can't see the bottom row there, that's the mean value. But roughly, if you dehull mung beans, you will reduce the anti-proteases and you will digest it better. And roughly, you'll get a 10% better digestibility. What's the message with all these numbers? Well, I'm telling you that legumes, which are the first three columns, have a digestibility mean of about 60%. It goes down to nearly 50% with some beans. What that means is, if you feel that you want to eat legumes to improve the lysine content of your cereal or millet meal, eat double. Don't eat what you think you should have been eating, eat more. Nothing wrong with that. Your colon will love it. And you'll probably be a little gassy, but you'll be a bit healthy. You'll be healthier. Spirulina protein, which is our reference protein, is 13 carbon labeled. It's about 85% digestible. Many people see spirulina as a great protein. Yes, it's good. Eat a lot of it. You can't take a little pill of spirulina and think you're doing well. That's what government programs are doing. They're giving 2 grams of spirulina and thinking they're doing a good job. Look at egg protein. It's about 90%. Oh, and by the way, the ethics committee told us we wanted to retire our chickens, which had laid so many eggs for us, back to free-range pasture heaven, where they would spend their lives in retirement. The ethics committee said, no, you can't. You cannot retire chickens. You have to sacrifice them. So we did. But then you're left with labeled meat. So we measured the meat digestibility, and we found that that's the best. It's about 90-odd%. So if you really want digestible protein, you've got to eat meat. Next, eggs. By the way, we have now a friendly goat, which is being fed with labeled fodder, and we're getting labeled milk. And we've been allowed to retire that goat back to a free-range pasture, so that's good. Otherwise, we'd had too much of meat on our hands. So at the end of this, what I want to say is eat more legumes. It's a good thing for you. But it's bad for government programs that work on subsidy, because if you've got 10 rupees or 8 rupees to feed a child, if the legume has to be doubled, you're in trouble because you can't make that work. So from the viewpoint of all of us who have access to foods and have the money to buy it, and there's no problem for us, I say eat more legumes. It's good for you. If you want to meet your protein, if you're vegetarian, think about that. Or drink milk if you want. If you're vegetarian, you won't eat an egg or meat, but legumes are very good. And you will be colonically healthy. What can I say? All right. But if you look at protein quality, and now you've understood what I mean by quality protein, that it has to be digestible, and it has to have good amino acid contents, and then you begin to look at the protein intakes of India, you begin to see there are deficiencies at different age groups. Of course, children are less likely to be deficient because they eat so much. Children eat high energy intakes, and that carries a lot of nutrients along with it. But as you get older, especially in old age, the protein requirements and the protein risks begin to start rising. That's when you really need your high quality proteins. And there's one thing I want to tell you, our habits. Everyone talks about indigenous foods and I want to tell you about habits. Tea. I'm sure you had your breakfast today and you had tea with it. Well, we tested the effect of a cup of tea on egg protein digestibility. And if you look at the top graph, that's whole egg. And you can see that every amino acid, whether it's methionine, on the x-axis are each amino acid, from methionine to phenylalanine, threonine, lysine, leucine, isoleucine, and valine. You'll see it all drops by about 20%. So think about it. I know the anemia people always tell women, please don't drink tea with your meals, because tea destroys iron absorption. Well, tea destroys protein absorption as well. So it's not a good thing. You know, there was a time when I was approached by the Department of Science and Technology, and that time there were these pictures in the Indian papers about food stocks in India. And there were these pictures of huge mountains of grain, and they were rotting. And the question was, can we do some research to produce grains that don't rot? And my point to them was, don't do this, because you probably could breed more grains with less anti-protease. But I think those anti-proteases are there for a good purpose, and that is to prevent rotting. So you want long storage in the open, you need those anti-proteases. Now you don't have anti-proteases, fine, take that grain, store it well, and make sure that you feed it. I think, again, this is food system. This is post-harvest. What do you do with your grain? How do you store it? Then make up your mind. But just, I think, rushing into research to improve the digestibility of pulses might not be a great idea. Maybe you have different ideas, but that is what I thought. And just to tell you where pulses and protein sources are in India, this is the wonder crop of India, the best food crop that we've ever had. Spectacular. Any ideas what it is? It's sugarcane. Okay, and you think, why on earth do you want to have the spectacular food crop? But yesterday I spoke about it. Sugarcane you produce in the highest amounts because of a particularly toxic mix of the high yield, it's almost 100 tons per acre, a cooperative that actually farmers get together, build a sugar mill, and that mill procures all the product output, so they are guaranteed in procurement. That mill produces sugar. Sugar is great for export. The molasses is good for alcohol, where alcohol is produced. And sugar is probably the one food item that is allowed to be taxed. So it's good for a state exchequer. And now many of these sugar cooperatives are actually owned by politicians. That's a spectacularly toxic but successful cooperative. And that's why this is going up so massively. Right now, elections are being lost and won because of the ability of the government to ensure adequate sugarcane prices. This is cereals. These are all the other vegetables. Look at pulses. It has literally flatlined. It's dead. If you think about it, it's dead. And people don't grow pulses in any organized way in India. Soybean is, yes, but that's considered an oil seed. But if you take all the other ones, they are all intercrops. And I'm looking forward to the day when people begin to grow crops on their own. This is demand and supply of pulses, and you'll see that our production is about 17 million tons per year. Our demand is only 12.5. A lot of the pulses, we're not sure where they go, but we're still importing about an additional 4 million tons per year. And there was one politically charged moment when our Prime Minister went to Africa in a government-to-government system that we were procuring pulses from Mozambique. Well, luckily it was only 0.1 million tons per year. It was a drop in our ocean. But even so, there are these spectacular schemes of government-to-government procurements that are going on. The important thing to understand is this. If you go out and buy pulses in the market, it's going to cost you. And yet, you can buy Canadian yellow pea, landed price, at about a fifth of the price it costs in the Indian market. And that tells you something. Our productivity is terrible. And I just wanted to show you, I have this here, that our productivity, if you look at FAO's figures, it says that India has got, from 1961 to 2012, we've barely touched our productivity. Yet Brazil has gone up, China has gone up, Burma has gone up, and Burma doesn't have any special irrigation for their pulses, but yet we import masoor dal from Burma. Canada is the best, Canada and Australia, and they have mechanized and very good farming systems. But given that it's so good in Canada, they can give us pulses at a very low rate. The Canadian yellow pea looks a lot like chickpea, and many of you will be buying besan. Besan is what you make your pakodas with, and you must be complaining these days, God, my pakodas don't taste good. That's because it's fake besan made with Canadian yellow peas, not good enough. You need your chickpea, but that's the way the world is. I mean, look, you want to feed people. I want to feed people, and if I want to feed children, I'd buy Canadian yellow pea because it's 20 rupees a kilo, whereas I'd have to pay about 100 rupees or somewhere around that for chickpea. It's a huge price differential, and I think these are things that we need to get right. Yesterday I showed you this slide about why farmers aren't growing what they want to grow, what we think they should grow, is simply because the incentives just aren't there. I think the incentives for pulses has now been given, although I've seen in the newspapers reports that farmers were complaining that the minimum support price was not being adhered to. They were not getting what they were promised that they would get. So I think between political will and actual action on the ground, through the layers of middlemen that exist, there's sometimes a loss of that political action. But I still think that if possible, I hope that people will begin to start growing pulses, although it's still best to grow cereals because you have someone to procure it and it's not a middleman-based system. And that's, well, I'm almost done. Well, Professor Alan Dango is here, and I should never, ever attempt to speak about environment and production, so I won't. He's going to be talking about it a lot. So we really need to know that, but more important, our undernourished populations live in environments where I think there are huge problems with the smaller your food. So because your villi becomes shortened in that. So we are looking at what the challenges are to provide optimal protein in undernourished populations, and how do we provide it? Can we be sensitive to the effects of climate change? Can we be sensitive to price and rural consumption? We had a great talk by Meenakshi, Professor Meenakshi, and I enjoyed that. I think these are important issues, particularly because the government gives certain amounts of money to feed people, and how do we get sensitive to that? And finally, there is this thing that we can breed pulses better. We can breed them. How do you breed them better? Stuff them with more protein. Yes, good idea, but that might change the way it feels to your mouth, may change the way your pakoda feels at the end of it. Or maybe you can minimize anti-nutrients. Well, anti-nutrients are also there for a purpose, and we just don't have good silos for grain storage. If you don't have that and they're stored pretty badly, you really need all the anti-nutrients you can get to keep your grains from rotting. So there are lots of little conundrums over here. I'm not sure I can answer any of them, but that's where I want to end. Leaving it as an open question for all of you, and trying to tell you next time you go, at least at the hotel yesterday when we were eating, every meal you get in India is dominated by cereals on the plate, huge amounts on this side. And you'll see small amounts, that's the legumes, by the way, a small katori of it. But do you really want a meal where you went and ordered something and you got huge amounts of legume and some meat if possible, or milk products, and a little amount of rice? So I'm saying eat more legumes, but remember, I'm adding another message, eat less rice. Okay? You can't eat everything and just go on eating. It's not a good idea. That's where I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kurpad. I think you'll all agree that that was one of the best keynote addresses that we've ever had. Questions, please. I don't know whether keynotes permit questions. Can I ask questions? No questions. Oh, sorry.
Oh, there's a question.
Dr. Longwa says no. What does the speaker say? Do you want to have any questions?
No questions allowed?
Keynote, you don't usually, but I think the
question, madam.
If the speaker is light enough.
There's one question.
Will there be any?
As to what you think are the dal and roti combinations you should be looking at, just based on composition, you may think it's good what you're eating, but she's going to give you a recommendation of what you should be eating in a combination.
Okay, I look forward to hearing that, but I don't know if you are aware that one of the Indian scientists, Dr. I forgot the name, but he had worked there at CIMMIT,
Sorry?
He had worked there at CIMMET. He is the World Food Prize, Dr. Wasser, and the name came to me right away. He had worked on maize mutant opaque 2, and of course he did a lot of work, got the World Food Prize for that work, and he has been able to breed quality protein maize with very balanced lysine composition. And the quality of maize protein is almost equivalent to milk casein.
Yes.
And again, coming to legumes, of course, legumes.
Have you eaten the quality protein maize yourself?
Yes, yeah, I have bread.
I have
bread for Himachal Pradesh.
Yes, it's opaque. It's not like the translucent maize grain that you see. And there is a sensory issue around
that. That has been taken care of. That part.
You mean you're getting it non-opaque?
It is non-opaque, yes. Yeah,
okay.
we are.
I have not seen that.
We will talk about it a little later.
Have you seen non-opaque quality protein?
I have bread even, not even seen, I haven't bread it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll talk tomorrow in my talk about
okay.
it. But again, like in legumes, we are aware of that we have protease inhibitor in legumes. That's why there are problems of legumes, protein digestibility in our system. We have bread cultivar in India, soybean itself, which are without any trypsin inhibitor. So kindly try to include in your further trial quality protein maize as well as the soybean, which are without protein. So that's what I just wanted to.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. The digestibility of legumes, of chickpea and yellow pea, we actually took the step of extruding them using high heat extruders. And it's remarkable that their digestibility went up from 60% to 90%. So extrusion by itself will do things. I'm not sure what good things, bad things are there, but extrusion certainly improves digestibility. What worries me is the polyphenol content in mung bean, for example. So when you remove the hull, you remove polyphenols. So I think de-hulling and then extruding is a good thing. I'm happy to work with QPM. I always was a little doubtful of it because I thought it was a fairly opaque seed and it wasn't sensorily liked by people. People want that slightly chewy maize that they can eat, at least in India. I'm not sure about Mexico and other places where they mill it and then eat it in a milled, cooked after milling. India, we don't mill. We just eat it straight off the cob. And eating an opaque grain off the cob is just nowhere near eating translucent and chewy grain off the cob. So I have issues about these things. Happy to discuss them with you, but I'm not going to accept what you say straight off. I'm going to tell you that I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done by you and by me, both of us.
I think I had some questions, but I'll do that later on, especially diarrheal disease. But anybody else, very quickly?
Yeah, my question. There.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, thank you for a nice presentation. I didn't hear much about infections. I like the idea of eating more of legumes, but then when we have a lot of infections and loss of appetite, how do you handle all of this?
Yeah, so you're talking about a sick child. A sick child is a different thing. I'm talking about public health, where we're talking about children who are apparently healthy, but a child who's sick is a completely different challenge. If they have no appetite, what are you going to do? Now, I think when children are admitted into facilities, yes, there should be a case for feeding them with energy-dense foods, which means they don't have to eat a lot, but they get a lot for every little bite that they eat. Now, I don't know if you're a great fan of RUTF or not, but RUTF fits into that energy-dense sort of thing, or an F100, for example. But this is facility-based. I'm not talking about that. I could talk about that if you like, and we can discuss this to death. We're talking about community feeding within a home. What do you do? Now, a child is sick, a child is sick. And that brings me to one important point. All of us here in the food system must realize this. We link to nutrition in terms of a daily requirement. I'm not sure that's just an artificial construct created by us nutritionists to say that there's a daily requirement every day for you and you better eat that every day. I mean, in reality, one eats in a variable pattern, and you can say, I have a weekly requirement or even a monthly requirement of something. That is why seasons work well with nutrition among us. Our body stores of vitamin A go up as carotene-rich fruits come up in the season, particularly the summers in India, mangoes, and then it drops off. So you can figure that one out. So I think even when a child falls sick and its appetite goes down, it's a question of what its stores were. And typically in protein, for example, we have found that a child can get sick and go anorexic. And then after the first sign that the child is doing better is it has an appetite. I have a friend called Alan Jackson who often says, no, that's not it. The first sign is when the child smiles at you. Yes, maybe. But I think the first question every doctor asks the caring mother or caregivers, what's the appetite like? And if the appetites come back, your job is to just feed that appetite, because there will be a better appetite to catch up. And you will find that kids will eat better. And so they've gone down and they come up. And I think if you want to go by the daily requirement, yeah, big problem. But if you're willing to consider that there is a loss of stores and then there's a regain, you're okay. But community, all right? This facility is a different issue. I know where you come from, so I know why you're asking me the question.
Communities where so many kids.
Sorry?
I asked that question because you have communities where a lot of kids are in that kind of situation. You know, they are not one or two, they are many. And that is why I asked the question.
Yeah.
So,
no, I've seen your papers, I've read them, and I know you've done great work. And I respect where you're coming from, but I'm kind of trying to keep it fairly simple in a family.
I think the organizers are telling me we need to close now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kurpad, for an excellent presentation.